Hey everyone, this is Andrew, and in this video I'm going to go over the very basics of a limiter and how it works. I'm just going to use the stock Waves, well not stock, the Waves L1 limiter. It's a pretty popular limiter. Limiters are very basic. They're essentially the same as compressors in many ways. You just got to kind of know what to look for. So I have the same setup as my compression video. If you haven't seen that yet, by the way, the link is in the description. And I'll link to it in the playlist as well for all these kind of quick tutorials and various mixing doodads. So on my screen here we have the Waves L1 limiter, and you notice just like the compressor we had the threshold, we have an out ceiling which is kind of similar to an output level, but it's different in a way. I'll explain in a sec. We have a release value, and then we also have an auto release, and that's pretty much it. That's all there is to it. So with the threshold, it works just like the threshold of a compressor. So you have some certain level. Let me hit play in my track. I'll turn down. I'm just trying to demonstrate the parameters to you, not necessarily the musical effect. We'll do that in another video. So as you can see, when I lower the threshold down to some certain level, the audio signal on the, this is kind of representative of how that signal is getting squished or compressed in a way. So, if I keep lowering this, I'll get this to 6 dB. So now every time the piano hits, I'm shaving off about 6 dB. I'll raise it up just because it's a little too much. Now, if you're wondering, what's the ratio? What's the what's the attack? What's the knee? Whatever. I don't know how the attack parameters work. I'm pretty sure it's essentially instant for a limiter in this, unless it's modeled off some analog gear and there's a certain value. But what I do know is that a limiter is essentially just a compressor with an infinite ratio. So if you remember with a compressor, if you had an input value that went over your threshold by, let's say, 10 dB, if you had a 5 compression ratio, and that 10 dB delta over your threshold would be scaled down to 2. What happens with the limiter is that the ratio is infinity. So if you have a delta of 10, you divide it by infinity, you get 0 essentially. So the way that works is that any signal that gets fed into a limiter just gets limited to your threshold value. So if I want to set -5, that's a hard limit on the output waveform. And I think I can actually open up a compressor here. I haven't rehearsed this, so let's see if it works and my theory is right. So if I drive this down to almost below, whoa. Alright, so it sounds awful, it's distorted and stuff, but you probably can't hear it anyway. So I have my limiter set so that it's very drastically limited to a certain value. So almost the entire waveform is being limited to this -15.7. So if you look over at the compressor, which I have staged after the limiter, you'll see that it's almost an entirely perfectly flat signal. This makes sense because almost the entire signal is supposed to be above that, so it's all getting just hard limited to that -15.7 dB. Keep making that more drastic, and if I go to -30, it's just this fluctuation of noise, and it sounds horrible. As I lighten up the limiter, you see those peaks are a little longer, whereas if I make the limiter higher, it's essentially not activating. And those peaks are pretty brief, and then they die down. But if I have the limiter on, that's the top of that signal is getting cut off and limited, so it makes those peaks a little bit wider. So the other aspect of a limiter is what's called the output ceiling. So this kind of has the effect of scaling whatever your input value is up to this out ceiling value. So if I'm saying that anything above -6 is going to be scaled back down to -6, or it's going to be hard limited to -6, and I bring this down, I'm kind of ducking it down, gaining it down. But if I compare this threshold at 0, output ceiling to 0, I'm doing nothing. But as I drag the threshold down, I'm making my signal louder to the point where it distorts. The question is it really getting louder? If I probe it, let's see what happens. I'm just going to do the output volume down here. So I'm peaking at about -10. Now let me drive this down here. The signal is getting louder. But not drastically. I mean, it's going from... There's a couple of dB, and to me it sounds drastically louder. But anyways, the point I'm trying to make is that what's happening is that you're limiting the peaks down to a certain level. But then since you have your output ceiling at 0, it's going to be bringing back and scaling up your entire volumes all the way back up to 0. So this has the effect of, instead of having little peaks at a certain high volume, it has the effect of making it so your entire instrument is at that full volume, which to your ears, in terms of, average loudness and RMS loudness or whatever people measure loudness in these days, the way it works is that, you might hear a little blip of a certain decibel level, and it might not sound loud. But if you hear that level just cranked up and everything in the track is even for that decibel level, it has the effect of sounding louder because on average the signal level is a lot louder. So that's one way you can use a limiter. You can use it to peak the volume of something to a certain level, and you can use it to scale that level up to a certain decibel level. There is the release value. I mean, often I will just set auto release and just let it do whatever, or I'll just leave it to the default value of 1, which to be honest, I never touch the release. If the release changes on any of my parameters, for limiting at least, it's because I'm using a preset. So I mean, if I even dig into the factory presets, that's 0.95 as a default, that's 12.3 as a default, and that's 1000 as a default. So if you want more information on release and how to control it, I'm obviously not your guy, because I use this as these two basic functions. I use it as a way to hard limit the audio and a way to kind of scale up audio. But the release is just how fast it lets go, and I can see why you'd want control over that, but in my experience, I obviously didn't need it. But apparently it's a thing. So, alright, that's pretty much it for this video. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more. I upload videos every single Friday on topics ranging from this to screaming lessons to synthesizer reviews to whatever. And yeah, I'll see you in the next video. Bye.